Irma Grese went from an ordinary life to becoming one of the most feared guards inside Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, where thousands suffered under a system built on control and cruelty. Her rise was fast, but her fall was even faster. And what followed after her execution only made her story more disturbing. Irma Grese was born on October 7, 1923, in Wrechen, a small village in Mecklenburg, northern Germany. This was farmland country, the kind of place where life followed seasons, not ambition. Families worked long hours just to get by, and opportunities were limited, especially for girls. Her father, Alfred Grese, ran the farm and expected strict discipline at home. Her mother, Bertha Grese, had a very different story. She struggled for years with depression, and by 1936 it reached a breaking point. That year, she took her own life. Irma was only 13, right at an age where people are still trying to understand the world, and something like that stays. After her mother's death, things at home became even stricter. Alfred Grese did not tolerate weakness, and there was no real emotional support system in place. Irma and her siblings were expected to keep working, keep moving, and not dwell on what had happened. That kind of environment can harden a person early, especially when there's no space to process loss. Around the same time, Germany itself was changing fast. Adolf Hitler had already taken power in 1933, and by the late 1930s the country was fully under Nazi control. Schools, youth programs, even daily life were shaped by ideology. For someone like Irma, who was already dealing with personal instability, this outside structure could feel like something solid to hold on to. In school, she didn't stand out. Teachers described her as average, sometimes below average. She wasn't known for strong academic performance or leadership. By the time she was 14, she left school completely. That wasn't unusual for rural Germany, especially for girls. But what came next is where things start to shift. Most girls in her position would move into farm work, domestic service, or maybe factory work if they lived near a town. Irma did try some of these paths. She worked briefly as a farm laborer and later as a shop assistant, but nothing seemed to stick. There were also reports that she tried to train as a nurse, possibly through organizations connected to the SS, but she was rejected, likely due to lack of qualifications or recommendations. At the same time, Nazi youth organizations were everywhere. They weren't optional in practice, even if they were technically voluntary at first. By her late teens, Irma joined the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. This group focused on shaping young women into what the regime wanted: loyal, obedient, physically fit, and fully committed to Nazi ideals. Daily life in the organization included physical training, ideological lessons, and strict discipline. Girls were taught that their role was to serve the state, whether through motherhood, labor, or support roles in the system. For someone like Irma, who had no clear path and had grown up under strict authority, this kind of environment could feel like direction. Over time, those ideas became part of how she saw the world. Obedience stopped being something forced on her and started becoming something she believed in. Authority stopped being something to question and became something to enforce. By the time she reached her late teens, Germany was already at war, and the demand for personnel in the Nazi system was growing fast. In 1942, at just 18 years old, Grese volunteered to become a guard in the Nazi concentration camp system. Her training began at Ravensbrück concentration camp, located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin. Ravensbrück was the main training ground for female guards, known as Aufseherinnen. By this point in the war, the camp already held tens of thousands of female prisoners from across Europe, including political prisoners, resistance members, and later Jewish women, and others targeted by Nazi policies. Training there was not about learning basic security work in a normal sense. It was about learning how the camp system functioned, and how to maintain control through fear. New guards were taught how to supervise large groups of prisoners, enforce strict rules, and carry out punishments without hesitation. Physical violence was expected in many situations. Guards were trained to see prisoners as less than human, as enemies of the state, which made it easier to justify what they were being told to do. This kind of conditioning slowly removed the barriers that would normally stop someone from harming others. For Grese, this transition seems to have happened quickly. By 1943, she was transferred to Auschwitz concentration camp in occupied Poland. Auschwitz was the center of the Nazi extermination system. By the time Irma arrived, mass deportations of Jews from across Europe were already in full operation. Trains were arriving daily. By 1943, well over 1 million people had already been killed there, and the system was still running at full scale. This is where Grese's name starts to appear more often in survivor accounts. Witnesses later described her as one of the most brutal female guards in the camp. She carried a whip and used it regularly. She was also known to have dogs, which were trained to attack prisoners on command. Survivors spoke about repeated beatings, often for minor or no reasons, and public punishments that were meant to intimidate others. The environment in Auschwitz was already built on fear, but certain guards stood out, even in that setting, and Grese was one of them. Another key part of her role involved selections. Prisoners would be lined up, often after long periods of starvation and exhaustion, and inspected. Those who were too weak to work, too sick, or simply considered unnecessary were separated and sent to their deaths. Witnesses placed Grese at these selections, pointing out prisoners and helping decide their fate. At just 19 years old, she was already part of decisions that meant life or death for others. What made her case more disturbing to many people later on was how she looked. Survivors often mentioned that she appeared young, blonde, calm, and almost ordinary. There was nothing outwardly extreme about her. She didn't look like someone people would expect to be capable of that level of violence. But that contrast is exactly what made her stand out. By 1944, Grese had moved far beyond being a new recruit. She had risen to the position of senior guard, known in the camp system as an Oberaufsicherin role under higher SS authority. That meant she wasn't just watching prisoners anymore. She had real authority, could give orders to other guards, and had direct control over large groups of inmates, sometimes numbering in the thousands. At Auschwitz, this kind of position carried serious weight because everything in that environment depended on strict control and constant fear. The camp was operating at full capacity during 1944, especially after mass deportations of Hungarian Jews began in May of that year. In just a few months, around 400,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz, and a large number of them were killed shortly after arrival. The system was moving fast, and selections became even more frequent. SS doctors like Josef Mengele would oversee many of these selections, but guards like Grese played an active role in organizing the lines, controlling movement, and sometimes directly pointing out individuals. Multiple survivor testimonies presented during later trials described Grese as someone who did not hesitate in these moments. She was seen taking part in selections inside the women's camp at Birkenau, which was part of the larger Auschwitz complex. Outside of selections, daily life in the camp was already brutal, but Grese's behavior often went beyond what was expected, even within that system. Survivors described frequent beatings using a whip, sometimes made of plated cellophane or rubber, which could cause serious injuries. These beatings were not always tied to rule breaking. In many cases, they were random or triggered by small things like walking too slowly, looking in the wrong direction, or simply being noticed at the wrong time. There were also reports that described forced physical punishments. Prisoners were made to run long distances, sometimes in circles, until they collapsed from exhaustion. When they fell, instead of being allowed to rest, they were beaten again. These punishments were carried out in front of others, which increased fear across the entire camp. It created an environment where no one felt safe, even when they followed every rule. Because of this pattern of behavior, Grese became widely feared among prisoners. Testimonies from survivors consistently placed her among the most dangerous female guards in Auschwitz. It's important to understand that Auschwitz had many guards, both male and female, and brutality was not unusual. But Grese was repeatedly named in the most violent category. She was still only 20 or 21 years old during this period. Yet she held power over life and death in one of the most extreme environments in history. In late 1944, as the Soviet army began advancing closer to Auschwitz, the Nazis started evacuating parts of the camp. Prisoners were forced on death marches toward camps deeper inside Germany. Around this time, Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Unlike Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen was not originally designed as an extermination camp. But by late 1944 and early 45, it had become one of the worst places in the entire camp system due to overcrowding and collapse of supply lines. It was in a state of total breakdown. The camp held tens of thousands of prisoners, far beyond what it was built to handle. Food deliveries had almost stopped because of the war situation. Clean water was limited. Sanitation systems failed. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly. Thousands of people were dying every week. Bodies were left unburied because there were not enough workers to deal with them. Survivors later described piles of corpses lying in open areas, something that even experienced soldiers had never seen before. In this environment, the normal structure of the camp began to weaken. Guards had less control because the situation was so chaotic, but violence did not stop. According to testimonies, Grese continued her behavior at Bergen-Belsen, much like she had at Auschwitz. Beatings, intimidation, and harsh treatment of prisoners remained part of her actions, even as the entire system around her was collapsing. By April 1945, the situation at Bergen-Belsen had reached a point where collapse was unavoidable. British forces, specifically units from the British 11th Armored Division, were advancing through northern Germany. The German command knew that Allied troops were getting close, and orders began to break down. Some SS guards left their posts and fled. Others tried to remove evidence or distance themselves from what had been happening inside the camp. But Bergen-Belsen was too large and too chaotic for any real cover-up. Grese did not flee during this final stage. When British forces reached the camp on April 15, 1945, they entered under a negotiated agreement that temporarily prevented fighting in the immediate area due to a typhus outbreak. What they found inside was beyond anything they expected. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were still alive, many of them severely malnutritioned and too weak to move. Thousands of bodies lay unburied across the camp. Estimates suggest that in the weeks leading up to liberation, around 10,000 people were dying each week due to starvation and disease. British soldiers, many of whom had already seen combat across Europe, were shocked by what they saw. Reports from that day describe the smell, the silence in some areas, and the overwhelming scale of death. Medical teams were brought in immediately, but even they struggled to deal with the situation because of how advanced the starvation and disease had become. Grese was identified and arrested shortly after the camp was secured. She was 21 years old at the time. Along with other guards and camp staff, she was taken into custody by British forces. At this point, her role had completely changed. For years, she had been in a position of authority, able to give orders without question. Now she was under guard herself, treated as a suspect in one of the largest war crimes investigations of the time. Witnesses later described her behavior in the days after her arrest as calm and controlled. She didn't show visible panic or attempt to escape once captured. This stood in contrast to the chaos around her, where other guards were trying to explain their actions or distance themselves from responsibility. However, being calm did not change the situation she was in now. The evidence was all around. The condition of the camp itself was proof of what had been happening. The British quickly began documenting everything they found. Photographs, medical reports, and survivor testimonies were collected. Mass graves were organized to deal with the large number of bodies. Former guards, including Grese, were forced to assist in moving corpses as part of the immediate response, which placed them directly in front of the consequences of the system they'd been a part of. Within weeks, preparations began for formal legal action. And the trial began on September 17, 1945, in the German city of Lüneburg, inside a former gymnasium that had been turned into a courtroom by the British military. It became known as the Belsen trial, and it was one of the first major attempts to bring concentration camp personnel to justice after the war ended. The case was handled by a British military tribunal, and it focused on crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and also at Auschwitz concentration camp. In total, 45 defendants stood trial. These included camp commandants, SS officers, male guards, and female guards. Grese quickly became one of the most talked about figures in the courtroom. She was one of the youngest defendants, and that alone drew attention. But it wasn't just her age. It was the number of accusations and how consistent those accusations were across different witnesses. The courtroom became a place where survivors could finally speak openly about what had happened. Many of them had spent years under total control, with no way to resist or even explain what they were going through. Now they were standing in front of judges, lawyers, and former guards, describing events that had been hidden behind barbed wire. The atmosphere was intense. Translators were used because witnesses came from different countries, including Poland, Hungary, and the Netherlands. Grese's defense was built around a common argument used by many defendants in these trials. She admitted that she had worked as a guard and that she'd been present during selections. She did not deny being part of the system, but she claimed that she was following orders from higher authorities and that she had no real choice in what she was doing. This argument was expected, but it did not hold up well under examination. The prosecution focused on showing that her actions went beyond basic duties. The trial lasted several weeks, running from mid-September into November 1945. And on November 17th, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. Out of the 45 defendants, several were sentenced to death, while others received prison sentences of varying lengths. And some were acquitted due to lack of evidence. Grese was among those found guilty of war crimes. The court concluded that she had been directly involved in the mistreatment and killing of prisoners, and that her actions could not be excused by orders alone. She was sentenced to death by hanging. At the time of the sentence, she had just turned 22 years old. This made her one of the youngest women to receive the death penalty for war crimes after World War II. The date for her execution was set for December 13, 1945. That day, she was taken to Hamelin prison in Lower Saxony, Germany. This was one of the locations used by the British to carry out executions of convicted war criminals after the war. The process was organized, controlled, and carried out under strict supervision. There was no public audience, no spectacle, no delay. Everything followed a set procedure. The executioner assigned to carry out the sentence was Albert Pierrepoint, who was one of the most experienced executioners in Britain at the time. He had already carried out hundreds of executions before, and would go on to execute several Nazi war criminals in the months after the war. His method was designed to be quick and efficient, using the long drop technique, which aimed to cause immediate death by breaking the neck. On the morning of the execution, Grese was brought from her cell to the execution area. Reports from prison officials and later accounts describe her as composed during this final walk. She did not resist or attempt to delay the process. There was no visible breakdown, no panic that could be clearly observed in official descriptions. This calm behavior had been noted during her time in custody after the trial, and it continued up to her final moments. The execution itself took place quickly. Within moments, it was over. After that, Grese was buried in an unmarked grave at Hamelin prison. There was no public funeral, no ceremony, nothing that would give attention to her death. And for a while, that's where the story should have ended. But over time, stories about her coffin being opened started to spread. claims that her body was examined again. Some even said there were strange details about her burial that didn't match official records. But there is no verified historical evidence to prove these stories. What did happen is that her grave, like many executed war criminals at the time, was kept anonymous to prevent it from becoming a site of attention or sympathy. The lack of information created space for speculation, and that speculation turned into stories. Stories that people still search for today. Because there's something about her case that sticks. People want answers that don't exist. But sometimes the truth is simpler and darker.